In this video, I'm going to tell you about my biggest struggle learning how to play jazz, and that's creating solo lines. Learning how to create interesting solo lines was so intimidating for me. I would listen to recordings of my favorite artists, and the lines they played were just so hip, but when I listened back to my own solos, they're so boring. I thought that the reason I sounded boring was because I just didn't know enough jazz theory. I thought I needed to spend more time studying, and so I read every book that I could find. I studied transcriptions, I filled my brain full of chords, voicings, scales, modes, extensions, alterations, everything else. Now that was time well spent. It absolutely made me a better musician. But it didn't really have an immediate impact on my soloing. While I was listening to my favorite recordings, like Oscar Peterson, I had this terrible misconception about what he was thinking about while he was soloing. But I thought one of the reasons that his solos were so much more interesting than mine was because he had more music theory stuffed in his head, and where he had more experience recalling that music theory and composing a solo with it on the fly. Now, as I've gotten to be a better player, I've realized that this isn't entirely true. What's actually happening is that Oscar's putting himself in kind of a flow state. While he's performing, I don't think Oscar's thinking much about music theory at all, actually. He's already done that. And I don't think he's worried too much about his technique either. He spent a ton of time in the woodshed. But I think he's at a point where he can just take a breath, let it out, and just play the solo that comes to him in his head. This guy Ben Patterson has a great album in the style of Oscar Peterson. Watch him play. Does he look tense? Does it look like he's computing his solo in his head? No way. He's totally chill. The music is just flowing out of him. One of my fellow YouTube jazz creators, Amy Nolte, she taught me that I should sing my solos. And when I started doing that, I realized that I cannot think about theory and sing at the same time. It's just impossible for me. And to think that I thought I could do all that and play the piano too? I mean, come on, there's just no way. So I realized that while you need to know jazz theory in order to solo well, you don't use jazz theory while you solo. This epiphany changed everything for me, and I realized it was the reason that I wasn't soloing well. Even though I could use music theory to describe basically any solo you put in front of me, I could not spontaneously create a solo that sounded anything like it. I'm not the brightest guy in the room, and so when I had this epiphany, it took me a little while to figure out what I needed to change. And I want to show you what I did to get over it. That way someone smart like you can get over this much faster than I did. So here's the heart of the problem. If you want to play a hip solo, you have to consider rhythm, notes, articulation, phrasing, and more. And you have to have solid ear training to get what's in your head out and into your hands. And you got to do that fluently over a set of changes while you're trying to keep up with two other people in your trio. This is all kind of like driving a car. If you go back to when you were 15 years old and you were learning how to drive for the first time, you might remember you spent time learning how to accelerate, how to brake smoothly, you were learning how to corner gently. But after a while, all this became automatic. You could really just focus on your destination or the song that you're listening to on the radio. You did all the thinking and practicing up front, it was now part of you, and you didn't really have to be conscious of all the individual mechanics to drive. This is the same way we need to spend time practicing. We are going to intensely focus on the mechanics of our practice, and then we're going to let them go when we perform. So we're going to go through this by constructing musical sentences, and let's just do a few of them together. So a musical sentence could be a question, or it could be a statement. We just want to be careful. We don't want run-on sentences. We want clear beginnings and clear endings. We need to practice making these rhythmic sentences starting from anywhere in the measure. So if we wanted to start on the and of 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. Or maybe we want to start on beat 3. 1, 3, and 4, and 1, and. Or maybe on the end of 2. 1, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and. So in the same way, we want to be intentional about where our lines end. So if we want to end our line on the and of 1, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and. Or maybe we want to end it on 3. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 3. You should go through a bunch of variations of this where you pick a specific starting point and you pick a specific ending point in the next measure and you connect the two. Now you can do this using simple eighth note lines like we just did. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. You could do this using syncopated quarter notes and 1. You could put eighth note triplets in there and triplet 3, 4, and. If you really want to impart a swing feel, then you need to make sure your lines end off the beat. I spent a ton of time transcribing other solos, and this is one of the things you notice right away, is that the great musicians, they end off the beat way more than they do on the beat. I started with rhythm with a reason because rhythm is just way more important than notes. You would be surprised how many wrong notes you can get away with if you play them confidently and with cool rhythm. But let's talk about the notes. I'm getting ready to throw a bunch of melodic concepts at you that you can use to solo. And I'm going to do this super fast, not because these are easy or unimportant, actually quite the contrary. I just want to give you plenty of things that you can take to practice. If you want me to go deeper on any of these concepts, let me know down in the comments. Most of the video ideas for this channel come directly from that little community we have going in the comments, and I would really love it if you would chime in. All right, let's get down to it. Everything I'm about to show you is going to be in the key of C, but you know this by now. You got to practice these things in every key. You got to do them in all major and all minor keys. Sorry, I'm not letting you off the hook this time. In order to internalize these so well that you can play them when you're not thinking about them, you've got to learn how to do it in all 12 keys. First thing we're going to do is play linear scales. You can go up, you can come down, you can start on different notes, you can make a short line, you can make a long line. When you do this, I want you to focus on aiming your line to end on a chord tone. You might be aiming on the 1 or the 5, but really the 3rd, the 7th, and the 9th are the most interesting places to land. Okay, the next one is chromatic motion. So we can go up chromatically, we can come down chromatically. Chromatic motion is especially useful when you're aiming for a specific note. So if we're aiming for the 3rd of C, you can approach it with a chromatic motion from the bottom, or you can aim at it from the top. So the next thing we're going to do is play our scale in thirds. We can do it up, or we can do it down. Then we do the same thing with triads, up and down. And then we're going to do it again with 7th chords. Once you've got those arpeggio things down, you're going to lead into them with a chromatic leading tone, like this. Just use a half step below the arpeggio. And if we're going to come down, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with the leading tone below the top note and then come down. And do the same thing with triads and with 7th chords. The next thing we're going to do is what Barry Harris calls pivoting, and that's where we take one of these 7th chord arpeggios, but we're going to change the octave halfway through. So we might take the 7th chord with the leading tone, but then drop the last few notes to the octave below. This is useful for all musicians, but it's especially useful for horn players who are trying to stay within their playable range. The next thing we're going to do are enclosures, and that just means we're going to pick a note we want to land on, and we're going to lead into it with the note above from the scale and a note below by a half step. So if we're aiming for C, and then go up the scale. The next thing we're going to do is combine scales with these enclosures. So we're going to play a linear line up, and we're going to aim for a specific note. But instead of playing that note right away, we're going to surround it with that enclosure. Make sure you do this up and down. So now, just like we did with scales, we're going to do this with arpeggios. We're going to do an arpeggio up, and we're going to end on an enclosure. And do it down. The last of these melodic concepts I want to show you is just bringing in colorful notes. And so that just means we're going to add extensions and alterations to our chord, and we're going to include those in our lines or our arpeggios. So if we're playing in C major, we might want to play the 7th chord that starts on the 3, on the E, because that arpeggio will include D, which is the 9th of the chord. That's one of our colorful notes. Or if we're playing a dominant 7th chord, we might want to give it an altered sound by bringing in a sharp 9 and a flat 13. Whew, now that is a lot to practice. And when you think about major and minor and all 12 different keys, boy, it's a lot. And you're going to discover when you do this that that's not even the hard part. That hard part happens when you use these concepts to make musical ideas. So here's what I mean. Let's invent a rhythmic sentence. Ba-do, ba-do-do, ba-do, ba-do, dot. Now we got to call our shot and pick the note we want to end our sentence on. So I'm going to pick the 3rd of C. So here's the hard part. How are you going to choose the notes to fill out the rhythm in a way that gets you to land on that 3rd at exactly the right time? So this is your breakthrough moment. And this is hard. Once you get here and you end up in the pit of despair, unable to do this confidently, but you decide to plow through and keep moving anyway. Once you get to that point, your brain has learned how to think about solos in a different way. You are just going to think arpeggio up and closure landing on the 3rd of the next chord. Pick your target and trust your training to figure out how to get you there. This stuff is so much fun. Don't get yourself in a hurry. I know we all want to sound like Oscar Peterson right now, but this is the fun part. This is where you become a professional soloist. This is where you discover your own sound. Have fun. This is the journey. Please don't feel like you have to wait until you can do all these exercises before you try to put them in a solo. This stuff is a lifetime of work. So you've got to take these ideas as you practice them and put them into tunes right away. There's a whole world for you to explore here. How do you move from one chord to the next chord smoothly? Can you make a single line that covers 2 or more chords? Can you invent some kind of a line and then use variations of that line to make an entire solo out of it? And spend time practicing by listening. Sing along with recorded solos. What are these techniques are they using? Where do they start and they end their phrases? How do they articulate their phrases? Are their musical sentences statements or are they questions? Are you excited yet? I know I am. In fact, I'm going to get back to practicing these myself. And while I do that, you're going to check out this next video on spicy dominant chords that every pianist needs to know. And I will see you next week. Bye.